Thank you very much, Andrew, and welcome everyone to our panel discussion on self-awareness and inclusiveness. How conscious are you of your unconscious bias? I'm delighted to be joining AXA and dive in to introduce the topic of unconscious bias and welcome our amazing diverse panel, and then drill into how we can recognise and do something about unconscious bias to improve inclusion in our workplaces. When we instinctively and unconsciously favour some individuals and groups over others, we're demonstrating unconscious bias. So then decisions about people, ideas and approaches results in some people being treated unfairly. Unconscious bias creates major barriers to inclusion, performance, engagement and innovation. It infiltrates all core people processes and undermines attraction and retention of diverse talent. The more we're aware of this natural tendency that we all have, the better we can watch for it and consciously create an environment where all employees contribute at their very best. Let me introduce our panel so that we can learn from their experience and insights in the area of self-awareness, inclusiveness and unconscious bias. First up is Kevin Leong, who is the country leader for Singapore for insurance for AXA XL. He's also the Managing Director Commercial Lines for AXA Insurance Singapore. Kevin has over 23 years experience in the insurance industry, including a number of roles in underwriting, market distribution and management. Prior to joining AXA in 2018, Kevin was the Head of Customer, Distribution and Market Development for Commercial Insurance Asia Pacific at Zurich Insurance. Earlier, he served as Chief Executive Officer for Allianz Global Corporate and Specialty in Canada. You'll often find Kevin out on Singapore's roads wearing some lycra and on his bike, so you should look out for him. So, say hi, Kevin.
Hi, everyone. Feel very honoured to speak here today. Thank you very much for the kind words, Lisa.
Thanks, Kevin. Next up is Nikki Quinn. She is the Chief Operations Officer of AXA Singapore. During her 16 years tenure with AXA, she's held various positions, starting in operations, moving through marketing, program management, M&A, customer experience and claims. Her role is very people-focused, dealing with customers, intermediaries and managing large teams. Nikki is Irish but actually born in Malaysia. And having lived in 11 countries and currently based in Singapore, she's no stranger to cultural diversity. Outside work, she's equally busy hanging out with her young son, having dinner with friends, trying to keep fit and planning her next travel adventure, which I suspect Nikki has been a bit challenging recently.
Just a touch, Lisa. Thank you.
Hi, welcome.
Thanks. Hello, everybody.
Our third panellist is Craig Acquah. He's the legal counsel for Chubb Insurance Singapore, being responsible for the management of the company's legal and regulatory affairs. Craig joined Chubb in 2018 and has over 10 years experience as a lawyer in the insurance industry. Before joining Chubb, he worked at a leading global law firm in London and also Singapore, advising clients in the aviation insurance market. Craig was admitted as a solicitor in England and Wales and holds a Bachelor of Laws from the University of Southampton. Outside work, Craig plays hockey for the Singapore Cricket Club and also plays drums in a band. Welcome, Craig.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you to everyone at AXA for organising such a great event on an important topic.
Thanks. And last but certainly not least, I'd like to introduce Iris Teo. She is the CEO of Marsh Singapore and she's responsible for the company's vision, strategy and performance, ensuring consistent high-value delivery to clients and meaningful careers for employees. She's a strong advocate for diversity and inclusion in the workplace. Iris is the executive sponsor for Marsh Pride and Women's Exchange. She was also instrumental in setting up the Young Professional Colleague Resource Group in Singapore. Iris is a regular speaker and panellist at diversity and inclusion events, and in 2014 she was named honoree of the 2014 Women to Watch by Business Insurance. It's fantastic to have you, Iris.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm very pleased to join the panelists today.
Thanks, Iris. Welcome to all the panelists, and let's get started with a bit of an introductory question. So I'm going to come to you first, Craig, and could you tell us about what unconscious bias actually means to you personally and then in a business context?
Sure, thank you. For me, unconscious bias means the social stereotypes that about other people that we form outside our own conscious awareness. It's something we all have a level of, and to me, it's both instinctive and learnt. Instinctive unconscious bias comes from the inherent need to feel safe and comfortable. For example, we feel comfortable when we're in familiar settings and surroundings around people who seem to be familiar, who look like us, they may speak like us, in the same language, or have the same accent. And that feeling of that need to feel safe and secure is a primal need and instinct, and has kept humans alive for thousands and thousands of years. On the other hand, learned unconscious bias are what we pick up from our environment, our family, our teachers, through our upbringing, friends, and even social media. Some examples could include all Asian people are good at maths, black people are really fast at running, white men can't jump. Often they're thoughts that go directly against our outward statement beliefs, but are just ingrained. The recent Black Lives Matter protests have massively raised awareness, obviously, about racial prejudice globally, but unconscious bias is not limited to race nor gender. It's 360, and as you said at the start there, Lisa, it permeates every sector of our lives. For example, the assumption that someone who is older is not good with technology, or assumptions about a person because they did or they didn't go to a particular school or a particular university. So when this translates into a business context, it can really affects how we go about hiring people, the social environments that we create at work, and this can have a really harmful impact if left unchecked.
Thanks, Craig. And I really liked how you talked about stereotypes, because stereotypes are one of the outcomes from our unconscious bias. You know, we put people into groups, and you talked about, you know, Asian people being good at maths and black people good at running, and white people not being able to jump. And, you know, I thought that's a really key concept when we start thinking about unconscious bias and what it means to us. Nikki, I'm going to come to you, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on unconscious bias and what it means to you.
Oh, thanks, Lisa. Look, I really loved what Craig said. The words really resonate. And I think for me, it's that learned stereotypes that affect all of us, our behavior, our choices, the decisions we make. In work, if left unchecked, you know, it will result in a workplace that's probably different to your customer base. And that's never a good thing, because you're not really representing your customers. But it also means that, you know, if you don't have those different experiences, you may not come at problems differently, and you may always be trying to do the same thing in the same way. In a social setting, in your own personal life, if again left unchecked, it can narrow your opportunities, your options, your choices, your social circle, you know, the friends that you hang out with, and therefore your outlook on life. I mean, I know it certainly probably explains a lot of the bad choices I made around younger boyfriends when I was dating, but it means that you are really limiting your choices. Stop laughing. Limiting your choices and where you take your life.
Thanks, Nikki. And maybe if we have time, we'll come back to that point about bad choices around boyfriends. We'll see if we've got time at the end. One of the things that I've become really interested in is how do we become conscious of what is often unconscious to us? So how do we know what our biases are? You know, how do we do that? And I'm going to come over to you, Kevin. I'd like to hear about how you uncover your biases and how do you make sure you're aware of them when you're making decisions?
Thank you, and this is a great question. And I think there was a lot of trial and error to come to what I think is a way. I mean, again, unconscious bias, two words, right? So one is bias, and the other word is unconscious. So for me personally, to get to what you can do to tackle this, bias is an opinion. I like someone, I don't like someone. It is driven by my life experiences, my values, what my mom, my dad told me. But if I'm honest with you, it also sometimes depends on my daily form. And it's always there. My kids have a bias. The moment they were born, they like someone. So we all have to agree first, we all have a bias. And it's, like Craig said, and it's very important, it's a natural instinct. You can't fight it. So ignore the fact that you believe that you're not biased, right? The problem really is the word unconscious. And this is driven out of my experience, out of my view, out of two things. So one thing is that I believe is there is not there. And the second thing is really, I don't have the information. And that's for me the most important part. I don't have the information. For that reason, I make an assumption. And the biggest problem for me is to turn this unconscious to a conscious bias. Again, I'm trying to get rid of the stigmata that bias is something bad. So I have blind spots. I'm a person. I deal with 50, 100, sometimes 200 people a day. The line of sight is not always there. So there are two things that you can do to identify this. Number one, I had in my life to really realize that I need to make active time to think. So my calendar, for the people who know me, has every week 1 to 2 hours where I just think about people, about what's going on, have distance to everything. If you're honest to yourself, how often as a leader, as a people manager, do you put active time to think about someone who works for you or who you deal with? The second thing that I try to do to eliminate unconsciousness in that bias is I'm asking others. Very often I say, well, I have an opinion, might not be right. I ask others for a second view. Doctors do this all the time. I wanted to close this also maybe to spark a discussion, and maybe you have some thoughts later typing this into the Q&A. I also found in my career that the lack of information is mostly around people who are a bit more quiet than others because I have less information. So I find it really, really difficult, and I really need to make an extra effort for the ones who are more introverted. And I know that I will spark a discussion. I also think that sometimes women who are more careful, more considerate, think twice, 3 times before they say anything, raise their hands, fall easier into the category than men who just sometimes raise their hands and say, yeah, I can do this. So these may be a few thoughts from my view on unconscious bias.
Thanks, Kevin. That was great. And I liked your comment around we often make assumptions when we don't have all the information and when we don't understand. And we all do that, and it's a natural part of being a human. Iris, I wanted to come to you and see, how do you uncover your unconscious bias? Is there anything that you do, I guess, on purpose?
Yeah, I think firstly, I resonate a lot with what Kevin just said. People make a lot of assumptions. So even for my own experience, I am an introvert. So in the earlier years of my career, I was extremely quiet. And there was this bias that I can feel that if you are quiet, then you must be timid, you lack confidence, you are unambitious, and therefore not the right person for the job, the project, the role, or whatever it may be. So, but the truth is, I was quietly confident and had the ambition to succeed in the job. So such biases were not only frustrating, but demotivating as well. So it took a lot of effort on my part to break out of it and be more visible, because it's just not natural for me to do so. So from my very own experience, I can understand how it feels to be, biased against in many of the decisions that managers could make. So, a lot of mentors and coaches, they would encourage their mentees and coaches to do just that. Speak up, raise your hands, and be more visible. But I would also like to encourage leaders and managers to be more open-minded, to be more aware of biases and not make a judgment, without any factual evidence. Not an easy thing to do because many of us make very quick decisions based on our experience and based on our background. But I guess we are having a session like this in Dive In is to make that awareness across people, make people aware that there is biases amongst us, and it is something that we all need to address.
Thanks, Iris. I wanted to ask you, I liked what you were saying about that you had to make a conscious effort to speak up so that people knew you had talent and knowledge. And you also talked about leaders need to seek out people, and particularly if they're more quiet, you need to go and ask. What have you done differently in a virtual context? We've all been at home now for months, or most of 2020 it seems. So what have you done differently in the virtual environment to make sure people are included?
Yeah, I think I have not done anything very different in virtual meetings versus in-person meetings. I speak up if I have to. And I think having virtual meetings, in a way, I see as a positive because we can have more people in the forum compared to if you are, in a physical environment. But I think in terms of being visible, being out there, sharing your views, making a comment, I don't see, myself, being very different from in-person meetings.
Thanks, Iris. Great insights. So I want to go to the panel now and hear some of your personal stories, and often I find that people connect with those the most. So what I'm interested in, and I'm going to come to you first, Craig, if you could tell us about a time when someone made an assumption about you that wasn't true, and how did it make you feel?
Sure, thanks, Lisa. I think there are many people who made many assumptions about me that haven't been true, and mainly based on the colour of my skin, unfortunately. Example I'll give you is I was a trainee lawyer. It was my first corporate job back in 2008, I think. And I'd just come back from lunch with my fellow trainees, and we were just taking a lift to go to our floor. And all my fellow colleagues were Caucasian men and women, and a Caucasian lady walked in the lift just behind us. This was a spacious lift. There were buttons either side, but she looked at me and said, "Level 6, please." I didn't really clock it at first, and so pressed the button and turned back to my colleagues to continue our conversation before we were to continue the afternoon's work. And their faces were a mix of sort of shock, horror, and disgust, because they were of the view that this lady had made the assumption that I was the lift boy. And once I realised, in that split second, that's what my colleagues were thinking, it kind of dawned on me that, of course, that couldn't be right. And so, it made me feel a bit shocked, ashamed, a bit angry. But it's a difficult situation when you're put in, when it's such a confined space. And I was a junior employee, so that could have been a client that was that had said that. So it's not the situation where I don't think you can answer back directly. It would be hard to. But yeah, it was a tough situation.
Yeah. Did you wish that you'd responded differently at the time, or
yeah, I think looking back, I think I would like to have said something. But as I said, 1,000 things are going through your mind when you're confronted in that small space with that kind of direct unconscious bias. And so it would be maybe difficult, especially being a very junior employee, to come back and say something appropriate.
Yeah. Thanks, Craig. I'm going to come to you now, Nikki. Have you got a good story about when someone made an assumption about you that wasn't true?
Yeah, look, I mean, there's many times where, as a female rising through the ranks, you're the one in the meeting room where you're assigned to do the minutes or the notes or get the coffee for everybody, and that happens more than you think. But I think the one that stands out is a couple of years ago we were hiring a PA for a team. And I got the resume through, a stack of resumes, and the first one said, under this lady's strength was she can work well for female managers. And I just kind of reread that sentence a few times, and I called the recruiter and I said, look, sorry, what is this as her primary strength that she can work well for females? And they said, oh, lots of people struggle to work with females. She can do it really well. Because female bosses are clearly more difficult than men, was the message she was giving. And I sort of responded in outrage, that she can work well with 50% of the population. It's wonderful. But thanks. I don't think she's quite the right fit for the team. And that really stuck with me. And I told that story to a few people, and a few women and men came back to say, yeah, I don't like working for female bosses either. And I thought, it's just wrong. Like what makes you a manager is not your gender. And so I have since then, dedicated my life to overcoming that particular sort of statement. And I work with young women coming up through the ranks now, and make sure that they know, that this is something out there. It's a bias, but that what really comes through is them as a leader, and not to worry too much about them.
Thanks, Nikki. That's such a fascinating story, and I hadn't heard that one before. But I was going back to your first point about, as you're coming up through the ranks as a woman, you're often the person who organises the coffee and takes the minutes. And I do remember a period in my career where I very consciously did not do any of that. And I also was very careful about where I sat in rooms, and I sat forward, and I did lots of things to show the mainly male room that I was here and I was an equal as everyone else. So yeah, makes you think.
Yeah.
Cool. Let's go to you, Iris. Do you have a personal story when someone made an assumption about you?
Yes. Well, not to me personally, but really to, the gender, carrying a title of a CEO. As you introduced, I do speak on some diversity event, and I talk about my journey to a CEO. And I even have questions like, for a female to be a CEO, you got to, don't people see you as a B to get there? You know what I mean? B. So it's like, it is really a question that I get from the audience, So that is really a bias against female in senior position, that you have, you don't get there through performance and result. You get there, through, being, unprofessional or whatever they have in their mind. But in some of these events, I do get questions like that.
Right. Iris, as you've gotten more senior in your roles, have you cared less whether people say those things about you? Have you learnt that, you got there on your own merits and you don't worry about those comments? Or?
Yeah, of course, for the first time when you get questions like that, you are kind of taken aback, and then you ponder over it. But then at the end of the day, now my answers to those questions are, you can't stop people from saying what they want to say, thinking what they want to think. All we can control is how we execute our role, how we drive performance, how we ask, we project ourselves and let our action speak for itself. I think that's all what we can do. We can't stop people from, talking.
Yeah, that's great advice, Iris. Thank you for sharing. Kevin, last but not least, have you got a story you could tell us about when someone made an assumption about you?
Thanks, Lisa. My story is similar to the one of Iris. So I want to bring a bit the touch around how cultural influence comes on this. So people who know me very often tell me how confident and extrovert I am. And actually I'm not. I was not. I spent actually a lot of my time being an introvert and working really hard to be the person that I am today. See, my family background is a typical immigrant story of my parents moved from Malaysia to Europe, and we were working class, barely got by. And when you are a kid, you need certain culture, certain values that you can lean on. And maybe some of the Asian audience who have lived abroad have heard this before. When you are in a different country and your Asian parents tell you, don't say anything. It's better to be underestimated, stay under the radar screen, and remain unnoticed. This is what you hear a lot in the Asian context. And very often you also hear in the Asian context, maybe I reach some of you when people say, oh, don't disobey, don't respect your seniors, don't speak up, and they are more senior to you. It's better that you keep your meaning to or your opinion to yourself. So there's that part in that. And it took me years to find the right balance, to work on it, to come out of this, what is culturally set into you, to overcome and say, hang on, it's not right. I needed to practice. I had to exercise. I had sleepless nights how to address some of my seniors, or to not to be seen as disrespectful, because we were raised all the time that this is not right. And maybe, again, with the Asian background, remember a lot of this upbringing yourself, right? So, and I spent all my career I wanted to be heard. And if I'm honest, I also hope that one day I'm in a position to address this in a different way.
Thanks, Kevin. What was really interesting about what you said, I was reflecting on my own experience. So I'm Australian, and Australians are very direct and sometimes loud. And we also don't necessarily respect authority. So one of the learnings for me is probably the opposite of you, Kevin. When I've been travelling to the US for work, or even in the work I do in Asia, and I've been in Asia about 6 years now, I've had to learn to be the opposite. I've had to learn to be less direct, be more gentle in my communication style and my approach, and to pay respect more to the hierarchy than I would normally as an Australian. So it's so interesting how our backgrounds really inform how we show up in the workplace and the things that we need to be really aware of. So thank you for sharing. I just wanted to say to all the participants on the call listening in, if you have any questions, please pop them in the Q&A box. We'd love to hear your questions. I've got a few more questions for the panel, but we'd love to hit them up with some great questions from the audience. So please pop them in. So next I want to talk about something that's often very controversial in my role. So I'm a head of diversity and inclusion for an big engineering company, big global company. And one of the things we often debate about is unconscious bias training useful, or is it a waste of money? So I want to hear from the panelists about, what do you think? Do you think we should have training? Does it play a part in creating an inclusive culture if we train people around unconscious bias? So I'm going to come to you first, Nikki. What are your thoughts?
Thanks, Lisa. Look, I attended my first unconscious bias training maybe 5 years ago. And it really was, I found it very powerful. It was only a couple of hours, but I'm a firm advocate of, I think training is really important. If nothing else, but just to make us aware of what this concept is, and then have us think about what our biases are. And, it's not something you need to spend a huge amount of time or money on. And it doesn't stop with training, by the way. It is a constant message in the back of your head. It's like when you drive a car, you've got a blind spot, right? So you're turning a corner, you're doing all that sort of different things as you're driving, but just check your blind spot every now and then and make sure you're not going to land yourself in trouble with some decision that you didn't know was going to get you in trouble. But look, it is something that you can take a horse to water. You can train somebody, but they have to drink. They have to actually practice it themselves. They've got to see the benefit. It's hard not to see the benefit once you start working through it. But for me, training is a really good first step. It also starts at home. expanding your kids' knowledge on the topic, just openly talking about it with friends, with colleagues, with teams. But yeah, it starts with training.
Thanks, Nikki. And I love that concept of checking your blind spot. I think that's a really cool concept about thinking about the car analogy, and I think that will stick with people. Iris, what about you? Do you have unconscious bias training in your organisation? What do you think about it?
I think totally agree, because first and foremost, I think it is very important to acknowledge that we all have unconscious bias, because no matter how much we might want, we might not want to admit it, unconscious bias actually influence a vast majority of our decision. So the critical component of an unconscious bias training, or even talking about it, making it a conversation piece, is creating the awareness for implicit bias, the stereotyping. And it exposes people to their unconscious bias, and also to adjust their automatic pattern of thinking. And of course, ultimately, the hope is to eliminate discriminatory behaviors. Having said that, it is useful, but it is not the answer, because it doesn't do much than just creating the awareness, unless the training comes with some practical elements of it that enable meaningful action when we go back to the workplace.
Yeah, that's a great point, Iris, that the training is one thing, but you need to take the training and put it into action. So I've attended unconscious bias training throughout my career, and one of the things I know now is there's usually a trigger for me. There's usually someone that said something or done something, and it kind of, it jolts me, and then I think about, why did that jolt me? Did I not like that comment? Did it shock me? And then what is it about me that made that happen? And then I start to think about it. And it's usually always about the biases that I might have as a person and what that person has done or said. So very, very interesting topic. So I'm going to come to you now, Kevin. So you're a leader in your business. I'd like to hear about, do you think that by building a diverse team, will that help bring down unconscious bias in the long run? Or do you think focusing on diversity itself is a form of unconscious bias?
I would tackle this maybe a bit more pragmatic, right? So at the end of the day, when we are running a team or company, it's difficult. It's dangerous to overthink it, but also not being conscious around this. We can't overthink it. At the end of the day, the team needs to get a job done, right? I think we all agree we need to do something and deliver a result. So I always check the technical capability of the individuals and the composition of the team first. Can everyone fill their roles as they're supposed to fill their roles? But diversity comes in how the individuals handle their technical tools, how they live it, how they work with each other, how they bring all of that background in, right? I personally think that each team can be diverse, and if it would not be, I think we would be really in a wrong discussion around it, because everyone is part of that, right? But I believe it's more around the role of the manager and the leader to give people room to allow that diversity to happen. So you can have the most diverse team on paper. If you don't give the room to the people that they can be free enough to speak up and live and bring really their A game, then it's no point. I mean, for me, that entire discussion around I&D in general comes to a very different word in my eyes, which I believe we have not really used around here today yet. At the end of the day, today, in all of the conversations around the Dive In Festival, if you ask me, it's about creating the right respect for everyone in the room. That's all it is. So yeah, I believe if you ask the right question, I'm always surprised what people come up with, and that would be my answer.
Thanks, Kevin. That was a tricky question. I'm going to ask the same of you, Iris. How does building a diverse team help bring down bias in the workplace?
Yeah, well, I'm a firm believer that a diverse team can and will make better decisions. So if your company upper management echelons are only staffed by a certain characteristics, leaders with a certain characteristics, then I think it's a signal for us to make it a priority to diversify our management team so that more voices and backgrounds are represented. We need to bring diversity into our hiring decisions, because if our goals are to hire a diverse workforce, then we have to make sure that there's diversity amongst the group of people tasked with hiring new employees. Otherwise, we may continue to hire the same kind of homogeneous workers despite our best intentions. So we also need to encourage our team members to speak up about biases, because the more people involved in the decision and the more transparent the decision-making process is, then it is less likely that the organization will be affected by unconscious biased decision. So to create a culture that encourages open dialogue is important. But there is also concern that prioritizing diversity may overlook the merit and miss out on hiring of the best people. Okay, but I think it can be managed if we look at our hiring process and make changes where necessary. For example, review our job description to be able to draw from a wider pool of applicants. And when reviewing applications, we can try out like blind recruitment, whereby we remove the name, the gender, the age from the application and instead hire on merit. We can give simple assignments to see what the work contribution would be like. But more importantly, I think standardized interview process is very important. An unstructured interview process will normally lead to poor decisions in the hiring.
Yeah, I certainly agree with you, Iris, and there were some great practical, tips there about how you can bring more diversity into organisations and how you can make sure the language in your job descriptions appeal to a broad range of people, perhaps doing blind resumes where you take out identifying information, and certainly having structured interviews and decision making makes a massive difference. So some great tips there for everyone. I've got a really great question that's come in from our audience. I'm going to come to you first, Nikki. And the question is, as best practice on diversity and inclusion, is there a percentage really on what's acceptable on gender? So is 50-50 enough? Race, age, marital status, etc. So there's gender, there's all these other attributes of people that we can think about. So how can we measure that an organisation is balanced on diversity and inclusion?
Thanks, Nikki. That's a big question. Thank you. Look, I'm going to start with going back to your customer base. If your customer base is close to 50-50 gender, the different nationalities, it probably reflects your country base. So certainly in a place like Singapore and in a retail market like ours, your customer reflects your population, and really your workforce should as well. And I get a lot of questions of, should you have gender quotas? And I'm actually a fan. And I know it's a very divisive topic. I am a fan. And the reason I am is because if we leave it up to our own not common sense, but the way we've always done it, we will still get the same results. And so if we start to put in measurements, what gets measured gets done, as I say. So if we start to put in measurements around this, we can start to track where we're going wrong. But all too often people say, oh, it's not about the quota, it's about the best person for the job. But the best person is defined by the person doing the interviewing. And that person, like all of us, is human and has their biases. So it's the best person in their eyes, but that again is just reinforcing their biases. So to me, we do need to move towards numbers, so in the race and everything, but what they are depends on your industry, your country, and there's so many more factors that go into it. So I'm not going to say what the percentage should be. I would love to be in a world where it's 50-50 because it's truly equal, and then it's based on merit. Right now, I feel we're still a long way off.
Yep. Some good comments there, Nikki, and I certainly agree. We're a long way off being able to get to any probably diverse workplaces in many of the places that I work, certainly. I'm going to come to Kevin. Would you like to comment on what Nikki was talking about? You know, how do you look at diversity in your business? Is it just on gender? At what point are you gender diverse, and how do you think about other aspects of diversity?
For me, that question goes back to the core of what Nikki mentioned around the quota, right? So I had my debates over the years on, are we a fan of quotas or not? Maybe what I know right now, I would say that you need a quota to start the pendulum swinging somewhere, because it was not swinging at any time. It has not moved. Yes, it ruffles feathers. Yes, there's a debate around this. But it created the debate, and it meant movement. It meant progress. Is all of that progress always calibrated the right way? Absolutely not. And that's not the point at the moment. At the moment, we need to get the pendulum moving first to have this discussion. And sometimes setting the quota might not always come to the exact right result, but is closer to the right result than it was before. These quotas need to be reviewed because the world is also changing, right? At the moment, in this call, and I could challenge us in the next theoretical model, that we're only talking about the quota between male and female, not considering other groups, is already old, is already anachronistic, right? So in the ideal state, as Nikki already said, we don't need any quotas on anything, because you could divide quotas between races, you can divide quotas on gender. It's not the point. At the end of the day, when we are leaders, and sometimes we have this role, and sometimes we have this role also as parents, we need to do something to set the pendulum in motion. And that's what I personally think about it.
Thanks, Kevin. A great response to a very tricky question and a really big question. So we've got lots of fantastic questions that have come in from our audience. So I might, I've got some good questions. Maybe I'll come to you, Craig. So this question is from Jean. Do you have any practical tips that can be applied in our daily activities to minimise the unconscious bias?
I think for me, when I first actually started realising unconscious bias existed, I went on a bit of a journey of kind of self-discovery and thinking about the assumptions that you make automatically. Because, as Kevin said at the top of the call, you might not have time, so you just make that assumption. And trying to take a step back and asking yourself, why have I made that assumption in the certain context that it is? Why was I surprised that when the captain's voice came over the tannoy that it was a female rather than a male voice that I heard? And I think that's the best starting point for yourself to go on the journey. And obviously there's lots of literature out there and videos and talks that you can read and get more and more into. But for me, I think the first step is asking yourself why, checking your blind spot, like Nikki said, why you're making these certain assumptions. And some of it will be down to stress and pressure. You don't have that time to think, but it's useful to step back.
Thanks, Craig, and I hope that helped the person who asked that question. Oh my goodness, so many good questions. I might come to you on this one, Iris. So what is your opinion on allocating D&I targets to senior executives? Would you see this as a tick in the box, as a must, as something, or as something too difficult to get buy-in for?
Sorry, the question is about target quota?
Yeah, I think it's about saying, and this is my interpretation, that often in companies, senior executives are asked to hit a particular diversity target. So it might be to have 50% recruitment of females in our graduate cohorts, or it might be to drive 30% women into senior leadership roles. So I think the question is about, what do you think about those targets?
Yeah. Unlike Nikki, I'm not a fan of quota or target precisely because of biases. When a male, for example, when a male leader says that I'm giving equal opportunity and I'm trying to hire or promote a female gender, I mean, just as an example, the question is, what are they looking in that female gender? Are they looking at, the leadership style that are very much like them? The male, the confident, the dominant, the typical male leadership style. If they are looking for that in a woman, it doesn't matter if you have 50% of the woman on the board or on the management team, you are still getting a homogeneous leadership style. So when we look into diversity, it's not about male and female. It is the style, the leadership style, the background, the experiences of the individual that we are looking for, and not male-female percentage.
That's a really interesting take, Iris, that you're not just looking for a woman because they're female, but you're looking for, is she female, but does she bring something different, a different experience, a different background, so that you get some better decision-making in your teams. Cool. Now, I've got another question here about maternity and paternity leave, and maybe it'd be good to hear how you handle this in your companies. I don't know, it might come to you first, Kevin. So generally there is bias by the company policies. So, for example, we often have different maternity and paternity leave. So the woman who gives birth to the child will have a longer period of leave than perhaps the dad or the partner in that situation. And that can lead to bias in the recruitment process. I guess because if you're going to recruit a woman and you know you're going to have to give them leave, then maybe you won't employ them if there's a man who could also do the job. So, how can we remove some of this bias from our policies in our businesses?
Very good question, because my company just went through a merger. We had exactly this when we reviewed two policies and compared them next to each other. So number one, you need to review these policies first. So I found in the past in my old life that I didn't look into this, and how many handbooks and policies do you have? And you say, once a year, let's do a spring cleaning, let's go through all of this, if this is still adequate, right? So you can't change anything if you're blind to that. Again, it brings me to my personal view that you need to make time for that. You need to do the spring cleaning of your mind, of all these topics for that. Once you see it, normally people will say, nah, that can't be right. And that takes very often a short discussion, and we all have the right, and the environment is right to have a kick at that, right? But very often it starts with the discipline and to look into this. And again, you're right. Then I believe you have to do it annually, or whatever time frame you said. I believe it's annually. But new topics come up. At the moment, it's eliminating the bias between dad or mom. But how about same-sex equality? What if someone same-sex relationships have a child? They are not treated in all legislations in all companies in the same way. So there are more factors to consider, and we learn along the way. You can't blame people for things you don't know. If you learn, you adjust. You learn, you adjust, and that takes rhythm.
I really liked that comment about you've got to learn and then adjust. And we don't just have biases in our processes around gender. We have biases around sexuality and ethnic diversity, a whole range of things. And I noticed this week in the Singapore press, there was a couple, a same-sex couple who had a staycation at a hotel here in Singapore and had a beautiful photo taken in the room. And there was a lot of uproar in the media about that, but also a lot of support. So I think in Singapore, we're starting to see some of these biases change around how we view people and their relationships, which I was really heartened by. I've got an awesome question here about how do we stop unconscious bias. And Craig, I'm going to come to you. So the question is, I find that stopping and taking a moment before acting helps me to not act unconsciously. What tips do you have to break the unconscious part of unconscious bias, especially in such a demanding profession and in a hyper-busy world?
Well, I think I touched on it slightly before, and the question itself does, is taking that step back. But on top of that, I think you can also, as I think Kevin said earlier, it's very useful and important sometimes to try and get a second opinion of the way you're thinking from someone else who has got some objectivity to the situation. You may be in a stressful situation, but going to someone and saying, hey, look, can I run this by you? This is the way I'm feeling about this. How would you approach this? What do you think? And I think that's a really useful way of, and maybe one or two people to try and get around a view. That's a really useful way of just getting another view and to see if you're thinking along the right lines before you then go and act.
Thanks, Craig. We've actually used something similar in our business. We've been recently doing a reorganisation and we had a real focus on diversity and trying to maintain or improve our diversity through that process. And one of the things we asked our leaders to do in a very time-poor environment was to, come together, make the decisions about who would be appointed to roles, but then go away, sleep on it, come back the next day, and then relook at the decision before communicating anything. And it does change.
Yeah, it's important to know sometimes you don't have time, and so you might make a decision and then you'll have to look back afterwards to see if you made the right decision, because we don't always have time to double check or ask someone else. So if you have to proceed, you have to proceed, but then have a retrospective look at what you've decided, the choice you've made and why, and you can then fix yourself going forward if need be.
Yeah. Another thing you can do in a time-poor situation is bring more people into the decision-making. So make sure you've got the diverse. So if you can't sleep on it, you have to make the decision now. Another way to do it is to just bring more people in.
And having the right people there as well. Not just everyone, the right people there that know the subject matter that you need to make decisions on. That's key.
Exactly. Okay, I've got so many great questions here. I did get a question from someone about, this was about me demonstrating my bias, where I said that Australians are direct, loud, and that stereotype is global. How do we break this stereotype as we all aren't alike? And that is very true. Obviously, Glenn, you were an Australian, and how do we break this cycle? And I guess for me, it's just getting to know people better, and as you get to know people, it was some of the things we were talking about, including people, talking to them, getting to know them better. But thank you for picking up on my bias about Australians. I felt I could say that because I am an Australian. But thank you. So what about, oh no, that one's been answered. Okay, here's a great one. I'm going to come to you, Iris. Too many times you hear senior executives saying that females need mentoring to be considered for bigger jobs. Are we saying that we want to mentor females to act as their male counterparts? Why is the mentoring needed by females, not the males, to progress?
I think what we are trying to do, it's not really mentoring the female and not the male, but I think over the years, the male has got very strong support group. You know, they go out with their guys drinking and share, and the support group is very established and very well. However, the woman is only in recent years that the women start to step into the workplace and try to grow their career. They don't have the same support group as their male counterpart has. And that's the reason why we are developing or setting up support group to help these women step up in that area. So I think the men equally, if they need that kind of support, I think management, the leadership team is more than happy to even support that. But not many of them feels that they need it, but women themselves feel that they need this support, this encouragement for each other, the mentorship to help them overcome some of the stereotypes that they are experiencing in the workplace, in society, and therefore that is this extra help that we are giving to the woman.
Actually, that was a great response, Iris, and I'd also like to talk to that because it's something I'm working on at the moment in my organisation. And the reason we think we want to, we don't call it mentoring women, we call it sponsoring. And for me, sponsoring is about having people in the room who will talk about you and promote you when decisions are being made about promotions or new roles, those kinds of things. And there's a lot of research that shows, in organisations, men often have male networks and women tend to have more female networks and some men in their networks. What also happens in organisations is men are often in the senior influential roles. So when decisions are being made about promotions and opportunities, they'll often be promoting the people in their network. So by creating sponsoring and mentoring, we're trying to create that same thing for women and get them into the networks so that when discussions are happening about opportunities, the women are being put forward as well. And it's one of the most successful ways to get women through to senior leadership roles. So that's me.
Well said.
Oh, thank you. I'm wondering if there's anyone in the panel, and maybe I'll come to you, Nikki. Have you had any personal experience where you've seen a colleague impacted by unconscious bias, and what was your advice to that person, or how did you make that person aware?
Oh, Nikki, you're muted. You're still muted. Let me go ahead and unmute you. Okay.
Sorry, I was about to say, am I on mute? And then I realized that question is completely overdone in 2020. It's funny. I have seen more the benefits of unconscious bias as opposed to people not necessarily getting ahead on unconscious bias. So I've seen people sort of be moved up on the basis potentially of nationality, where they went to school, the ethnic background. And you do sort of, there's not one particular example in mind, but I do sort of sit down with team managers and sort of have a chat about, you are aware that you've got one single race in your whole team. And, in a place like Singapore, where it's quite, you need to keep an eye on the races in the business, because there's so many different, it's such a multiracial country. So, or the ones where you say, look, you only hire guys. What is that about your team? Is it really that there's no women? And then they start bringing up a story about how somebody went on maternity leave for 9 months and they don't want to go through that again. So, not one single question, but there's so many examples out there of why people get promoted for the wrong reasons. So that is that the halo effect. You like one thing about the person, therefore they must be able to do everything. They must be good at it. And potentially that horns effect. There's one thing you don't like about them, so clearly they're not the right person for the job.
Yeah. So, Nikki, while you were speaking, Kevin was nodding vigorously. So I want to come to you, Kevin. Have you Have you seen this happen? Have you seen bias affect people's, I guess, promotions in the workplace or how they've been dealt with in the workplace?
Yes, so let me flip this around, and I hope I spark a bit of reactions with the audience, and that you give me your views around them. At the moment, we react a lot, and we talk a lot about how companies react, what we as leaders can do to build an environment around that. But let me challenge a bit back, because we all have also our own personal development story. So Nikki called the halo effect. So the real thing, and if I want everyone to think about, is also what can each individual do on their own to create their own halo effect, right? So we talked about, and Craig mentioned it earlier, to be able to speak up, to be able to be part of the process to eliminate the unconscious bias about oneself, right? So I talked about earlier about the introverts, and again, I want to spark this discussion that from the tendency, again, please correct me, but Lisa, you mentioned something similar as well earlier, that women tend to take more time to rethink 2 or 3 times to apply for a job, being thoughtful around, do I manage the expectations, can I do it? And that is part of the unconscious bias time, because very often there is a time frame to it, right? So I would rather focus on that part, on what can we do to get the ones who are a bit more quiet to speak up and say, I know you're not saying everything that you can do. I know there's something more. I think that's a bit more interesting, because if I'm brutally honest, sometimes it's a bit annoying when you just hear the ones who are the loudest in the room to say, okay, they can do it, right? And that would be maybe a different way how I would answer this.
Thanks, Kevin. So I've got a really interesting question here, and as I've been thinking about who to allocate it to, I've been thinking about my own career, but I might come to you, Iris. So the question is, reflecting back on your early education options and career choices, has there been an instance when someone's bias has impacted your career direction? And so when I was thinking about this, I was thinking about my parents, or I was thinking about what my friends were doing. And, you know, do you think things have improved, I guess, in terms of career options for people?
Well, definitely things have improved, over the years, in fact, I must say over the last 5-6 years, where we are more aware of biases, we are more aware of diversity, it has improved. But in my earlier years, I mean, it is not just one instance or one experience that we feel that could have impacted, what we are today. But maybe I just share an experience which I always, like to share, because when I was a broker, a young, broker, I used to join the risk engineer for site surveys. So I go with my engineering colleagues for surveys, just to get close to the client, to understand their risk better. And the problem I had was they never have a safety boots my size. All the safety boots are large men's size. So it is almost like, nobody expect a woman to go into a construction site or a manufacturing site, as a guest, as a visitor. So the only thing is, if I want to stay on as a broker, if I want to continue to understand my client, to be there at their side, I need to buy my own pair of safety boots. So that's my solution to it, buy your own boots, because, every time you go into a site, nothing fits you, because, there's this bias that only men comes into the site.
Yeah. I have had that experience with safety boots, Iris, and I've noticed in the last couple of years that there are companies that produce PPE, so personal protective equipment, that do cater for women, which is super nice. So thank you.
So things have improved.
Sorry, Iris.
Yeah, so like you say, things has improved. Now they even cater, to the woman's size.
Yes. Nikki, I wanted to ask you the same question. So when you think back to your early education options and career choices, was there someone else's biases that affected your decisions about what you wanted to do?
Look, when that question was first asked, I was like, when I was so I had an example which literally changed my life and the direction of my life. So, and for good. So I was working in Ireland in my first job, and I really wanted to move to London. I had a boyfriend living in London, and I thought it's time to go. So I got through the interview process, a really, really good investment bank, and went through the whole process in Dublin, and then they flew me to London, where I had a 6 or 7 person panel interview. And, age, 25, I thought I aced it. I was so happy. It was going so well. And then the last interview, I walked in, and it was also another Irish guy. And I thought, nailed it, like before. And he had my resume in front of his hands, and he goes, you went to Trinity, which is one of the universities in Dublin. And I went, yeah. And the way he said it, I just knew I was done. So he was from a sister university in the country, and there's, I thought it was just joking rivalry, but he clearly had some views about the type of person that I would be. He alluded to, did your father pay for your education, or something along those lines, where it's completely inappropriate. I never recovered. I never recovered from the first 5 minutes of that interview. And, it didn't surprise me when the recruiter called back to say she was shocked that I didn't get it, that everything else had been glowing, but there was one person. And I asked her, I said, was it the Irish guy? And she goes, yeah, it was. No one could change his mind. And I thought, okay. So I didn't get the job in London. What happened then instead was I packed up my life and I moved to Australia. And that turned out to be a brilliant decision for me. And, here I am in Singapore, loving life and all good. So everything happens for a reason, even those unconscious bias stories.
Thanks, Nikki. I'm sure there's a few of us who've had some pretty horrific recruitment stories. That's a particularly good one. There's a great comment in here, and I'm going to come to each of you and ask you this question. I'm going to start with you, Craig, but it's from Siri, and the question is, perhaps instead of encouraging quiet people to speak up, traditionally a male trait, unless you're Australian, clearly, we should encourage everyone to listen more loudly. So my question is, how do you listen more loudly in your organisation or as a leader? What do you think, Craig?
Sorry, just unmuting. That is a great question. I think it comes back to part of what Iris was touching on earlier about being introverted. And I think you just really have to encourage people about being aware, more aware of other people and what's outside what's normal to them. And we are in quite a traditional industry in insurance, where there is an assumption that the louder people are more active, they do the work faster, and they get things more done. But that's not always the case. And we need to be aware that there are people in the organisation that can do the work just as well, if not better, than people who are louder. And I would encourage again people just to take a step back and think, well, why have I made that assumption about that person in that way, in that context?
Thanks, Craig. Kevin, what about you? How do you listen more loudly in your organisation?
I'm in two minds on this question. So on the one hand, I agree with that you have to listen more carefully. Again, I've been there, right? So things that you can do, and I think remote working helps, is you take someone aside and not ask someone questions in public. Very often you can use, for example, the chat function in calls to say, hey, this topic comes up. I know you've been working on something. What is your view? And then you encourage people to speak up. There are there are moments in where you have the technique and say, hey, let's go through the round. You ask everyone to express their views. So that's the part what you can do to listen more carefully. But there's again also the part of emotional safety, right? Very often it's not only about being introvert. Sometimes it's also the fear to speak in public. So it's creating that environment as well. So, but I don't think that there's a recipe for only listening more loudly. At one point, in order to be heard, you must find at least accentuated a voice. There's no way around that if you ask me personally.
Thanks, Kevin. So I think that was you've got to find your voice, but also have ways to listen to, I think, the organisation. Nikki, how do you listen loudly in your part of the business?
Look, I probably would work on creating smaller groups. So, the people might not feel comfortable in the bigger groups where you have the big personalities. So you create smaller subgroups, teams, and if you really want to draw somebody out, you give them a special project. It's not extra work. It's a special project, something that they develop their strengths and then have them present, but also make everybody else know that these guys are the ones presenting. These are the topic in charge. And the rest of you who like to talk a lot should probably listen a lot now. But it's a tough one. I'm with Kevin. It's somewhere between both. It's actively taking the really dominant people aside and saying, maybe for this one, let's hear what the rest have to say outside of the whole meeting, and then really encouraging the others. But best in smaller groups. Quiet voices get lost in really big groups.
Thanks, Nikki. And to you, Iris, is there anything you do in your organisation to listen loudly?
I think the first step is to acknowledge, the potential for bias and how it can affect others. So make sure that minority groups has a chair at the table and that everyone has a chance to speak up at meetings. And if possible, I think we should seek out opportunities to expose ourselves to the minorities' experiences. It is nothing like, experiencing it ourselves. We cannot be in their shoes because we are not them, but to seek out opportunity to at least try, to put ourselves in their shoes. I think that's to me very important.
Thank you. I really like that notion of making sure you go around everyone, hear from everyone, making sure you've got representation of different groups in the room. And I've often been in meetings when, the quietest person speaks last and has the best idea and cuts through and makes a massive difference. So thank you, Iris. I've got a really interesting question here about some advice. So I'm going to read the question, and then maybe if one of the panelists would like to answer it, maybe put your hand up. But it's from Jackson Yosei. He or she, I'm sorry, is in a situation where they're aware of some bias and they'd like to know, should I confront and correct or just let it be? If the person involved is a senior, head of department or business, should I go ahead? So should I go and confront this senior person about the bias that they're seeing, or should I leave it alone because it'll burn some bridges? Is there anyone who'd like to put up their hand for that one?
Maybe I just share, my views. I think we should speak up. We should not stay quiet. We should speak up. But the manner in which we speak up is important. Show respect also when we speak up rather than being confrontational, because when you're confrontational, you kind of get a defensive reaction almost like automatically. So it is how you bring up, how you speak up with respect and with reasons, with a strong kind of reasoning behind why you feel what you feel, and generally speak up about your views. That's what I would advise.
Thanks, Iris. So your advice is to speak up, but be careful how you do it. Does anyone else want to add anything?
Yeah, I'll add just a quick one, just to add on to that. I think it's the manner of how you speak up, and whether if that bias is happening to someone else and not you, have you got the full sets of facts and information and context, or are you just seeing part of the picture? And then if you do really feel like you need to speak up, then going through the appropriate channels, if we're talking about a workplace, directing it towards your boss or HR, the appropriate person to raise the discussion, you can then have a discussion with that manager in the appropriate context.
Yeah, and that's it's a different perspective. So there are different ways you can handle things, right? You can handle it yourself, or you can go and get some help. And the organisations that we work in often have good support people who can help you and deal with issues. Yeah. I once had an example. I was working with a leader who was excluding one person in the team, and the way he was doing that is he'd invite each of us out for coffee each morning. Sometimes it would be one of us, sometimes it would be a small group, but he was always excluding one person. And so I'd really noticed the bias, and the person that was being excluded had certainly noticed. And on one of the coffee mornings I went on, I just said to this leader, hey, do you realise you're not inviting, Matt over there for coffee? And he went, oh, yeah, I noticed. Yeah, I don't like him. You can't do that. We're in a team and we're all in this together. And but that was a less tense situation, but it was having a massive impact on the person that was involved. And so by just me raising it, he changed his behaviour. He realised that what he was doing was not right. So but thank you for your perspectives. I wanted to go around everyone now, I guess, with a bit of maybe a final question about, what's one thing you'd like to change now, whether it's something personally or is it something in your business? You're all leaders in your business, and, what's the one thing that you'd want to take away from this? And maybe a piece of advice that you would give our audience. So I'll start with you, Craig. So what's one thing you want to change or do differently?
I think for me, one change I want to make, and one thing I'll challenge everyone to do, is to try and step outside your comfort zones, the realms of what's normal to you in your everyday life now and then. Try and make a new connection, someone outside your social group from a different ethnic background or a religious background, because the more you have knowledge about other beliefs, other religions, other people, other cultures, the less fearful you are. And that instinctive bias where you make an instinctive judgment based on someone's appearance, someone's religion, that ebbs away because you know more about it. You're less fearful of it. It becomes more within your realms of normality. So I'd challenge everyone to step outside their comfort zones and make a new connection and just educate yourselves a bit more about other cultures and people.
Thanks, Craig. Is such good advice. I've been in Singapore for about 6 years, and one of the things I looked forward to moving here was to meet people from different backgrounds. And after I'd been here for 2 years, the only people I really knew outside of work were people who looked like me. And it was a real wake-up call that, the reason I moved to another country was not to meet people like me, it was to meet people who weren't like me. So I really appreciated your advice. Iris, let's come to you next. What's one thing you'd like to change?
I think it's one thing I would like to continue doing, because I can see good results from it, is, colleague resource group. Colleague resource group can be a very effective voice against biases and promotes diversity and inclusion, because at Marsh, we formed colleague resource group for women, to support the gender diversity, women gender diversity, and we call it the Women Exchange. We have March Pride, which is a colleague resource group for the LGBTA community. And we also have a resource group for young professionals, for our young talent. So, but we will not stop. We will not stop there, because I'm seeing that, that support group has generated very good results in D&I in the office. So we will not stop there. We will continue to set up resource group for, families, for races. And my advice, to the participant here is to be an advocate for the minority group, take responsibility, put ourselves out there and advocate for the minority group. Speak up. So that's my advice.
That's great, Iris. So get involved and be advocates or allies with people who are maybe not as well represented as you. We have, I think we call them colleague groups. In my organisation, we also have groups of employees who come together. So we have women's group, we have black employees group, and they're so valuable for us in providing an inclusive culture for our workforce, but also helping us make organisational decisions. And we use those groups when we're implementing new, people policies and initiatives, and they give us great information. So thank you. Kevin, what's one thing you'd like to change or do differently?
I'm not sure if I want to do what changes right now, so I'm a bit concerned about something. I mean, COVID has magnified and extrapolated a lot of inherent problems that we already had as a society. And my biggest fear at the moment is that the COVID-19, that we're losing ourselves in the crisis. You find nationalistic movements, a lot of things everywhere, people hiding behind economical reasons that certain behavior is suddenly all right. I'm a bit afraid that we're slumping into a societal crisis. So I would be happy that over the next 12 to 18 months, that we wouldn't lose ourselves first before we say about improving. I would really, really be happy just with that people are not losing what we've been building over the last years to come to committees like this, what we're talking about, because I see a lot of things at the moment because of this crisis, hiding behind the crisis, going overboard.
Thank you. And I think we're not just seeing that in Singapore, we're seeing it all over the world. And it is a big concern. So thank you. And Nikki, let's hear from you. What would you like to do differently or change?
Mine's a little different and a little personal. So one thing I've taken away as I've prepared for this wonderful event, thank you, Lisa, is in many ways I live in a bubble. I think we all live in little bubbles. So a bit of personal information about me is I'm a single parent by choice. So I had my son through IVF a couple of years ago when I realized that Disney didn't fulfill on its promises. And it was the hardest thing I've ever done, and it was the single best thing ever, hands down. And I realized that as I've been talking through this and talking to other people about this event and unconscious bias, that there is a taboo about fertility, about choosing to be a single parent, and I can help with that. So I've got a great story, but more than my story, it's a way. If I could help somebody get that same level of happiness that I've gotten, then, I'll do it. So it's really about speak up about the taboos, break them, reach out if you think someone's struggling. And yeah, so that's what I'm taking away.
Thank you for sharing, Nikki. And I actually have a friend who's done a very similar thing to you, and I respect her so much, and I feel like she's one of my bravest friends. So thank you for sharing something so personal. So I'm going to finish off here. We've only got a few minutes left. I just wanted to do a bit of a recap. So we started at the start, strangely enough, talking about what unconscious bias really means to us, both personally and in the business context. And we talked about how unconscious bias really drives decisions we make, and if we're not careful and we don't catch our biases, it can mean the decisions we make are not fair to some people. Then we talked a bit about how do you become aware of unconscious bias, how do you take something that you don't know into something that you know, and then, you know, how important is training? Should we do training in our organisations? And I think the answer was yes, that we need to show people about what unconscious bias is, but training's not enough. We need to be able to take training and put it into action. So what are some of the practical things we can do to prevent bias in some of our processes? Iris talked about recruitment in particular, where there were some really practical things that we could do to make sure that we look at people on what they can do and their experience rather than their gender or their age or their ethnic background. Our panel shared some amazing personal stories about when they've experienced unconscious bias, and I'm pretty sure all of us have had those points in our lives where someone's made an assumption about us that wasn't true and was potentially hurtful. Then we went a little bit deeper and we talked about, you know, as leaders in our businesses, will having diverse teams help with unconscious bias? Will it make things different in the long run? And there were some varying perspectives on that, but I think ultimately if we have diverse teams and we can teach them how to work with each other and understand each other, it will help us bring biases up to the fore. Then we had some amazing questions from our audience, really amazing, challenging questions like, should we have quotas or not? I personally believe we do, because if we don't measure things and we don't have goals, they don't happen. And some great questions around maternity leave and paternity leave policies, and there are many policies in our organisations that have the potential to drive bias in our decision making. And then finally we talked about what are some things that we want to change now, and we had some really great comments and advice from our panellists. So Craig talked about, you know, going and meeting people who are not like you, who don't look like you have different backgrounds, might be different ages. And I've worked in organisations where we almost speed date people, and we have lunches or coffees and we try and get people to meet different people. And then I talked about my own experience moving to Singapore and not having any Singaporean friends, which, you know, I felt really upset about. Then Iris had great advice around being an advocate and an ally. So when there are people in our organisations and our communities that are underrepresented, they need people to advocate and to support them and to make sure they get a fair go. Kevin talked a lot about the experience of COVID and how in many countries around the world we've become more, I don't know if small is the right word, but more nationalistic, and it's almost given some people the right to behave in a way that's not inclusive, and it is biased, and we don't want that to continue. And finally, Nikki talked about really speaking up and sharing your stories, because that can help someone else. And, you know, I loved your personal story, and I'm sure there are people listening who might want to do something the same as you have done. So thank you so much for that. I just want to say thank you for all our panellists. That closes out our panel today as part of Dive In, and it's been an absolute pleasure hosting. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.